Thanks so much, Judy, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking our extraordinary hosts at Radcliffe, Liz and Judy and Rebecca and Sharon and Mervy and all of the wonderful staff. This has been an incredible fellowship year for me, and I'm very grateful to be a part of it. I've got to say, it is a lot of fun to be able to present my work to my colleagues, to the other fellows in this year's cohort. And I want to tell you that I am absolutely in awe of all your work and the seminar series that we have on Monday and Wednesdays. I just enjoy them immensely, and I feel very privileged to be spending a year with you, my fellow colleagues. So this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about what has come to be called mass incarceration. And mass incarceration describes a novel experiment in criminal punishment that was conducted by policymakers in the United States over the last 40 years. And old principles of rehabilitation and proportionality in sentencing and individualized treatment were all substantially abandoned, and they were replaced by principles of retribution and deterrence and incapacitation. And the main effect of this revolution in criminal justice was five-fold growth in the scale of prisons and jails in America. And this new system of punishment represents a new chapter, not just in how we've responded to the problem of crime. The institutional landscape of American poverty has also been transformed. And so today I want to do three things. First, I want to set the stage a bit by talking about some work I've been doing over the last 10 years, trying to understand the scope and consequences of incarceration in America. Second, I'll talk a bit about some new work that's been my focus at Radcliffe. And third, I'd like to explore how we might make change, what change in perspective or what change in values might be necessary for reform of this system. So how does an Australian sociologist come to be working on American poverty and incarceration? Well, Australia was a penal colony, and real Australian aristocrats have some convicts in their ancestry. So maybe that's the connection, and it's a good guess, but my family ties, some of them anyway, aren't nearly as deep as that. My mother came to Australia as a student from Thailand in the early 1950s, and that was the time of the White Australia policy. And the White Australia policy prohibited everything but European immigration. So when she arrived in Australia, she wasn't a member of a minority group because there was no real group to speak of. It was just her and a few other foreign students, all of whom were expected to leave after they finished their studies. But my mum met my dad, and he wasn't going to Bangkok, and she stayed. Now, Australia in the 1960s and the 1970s wasn't an easy place for a young Asian woman. And my mum encountered a lot of racism, and some of which we heard about, but a lot I tend to think we did not. And for all her adult life, really, she was an outsider. Now, my mum's a law-abiding old Asian woman. What does this have to do with mass incarceration in America? Well, incarceration is all about outsiders. And if you weren't an outsider before you went to prison, you became one at the moment of intake. And from my mum's perspective, a lot of life then becomes a struggle for agency and for dignity and a righteous place in the world. So let's turn to the topic of mass incarceration. Let's think about prisons in America. And I want to begin by providing some broad empirical context. We measure the scale of a penal system in a country with an incarceration rate, and this is the fraction of the population that are locked up on any given day, and this is commonly measured as a rate per 100,000 of the population. And if we look at incarceration rates in Western Europe, Across all the Western European countries in 2011, incarceration rates were around 100 per 100,000, about 1/10 of 1% of the population were locked up in Western Europe on any given day. And if we compare this to the United States, the US incarceration rate is nearly an order of magnitude larger. And we can think about the unusual character of incarceration in America also in historical context. And we have very good data on prison populations that go back to the mid-1920s. And if we go back to 1925 and we look for a 5-decade period through until the early 1970s, we can see that the incarceration rate in the United States is around about 100 per 100,000, exactly what it is in Western Europe today. But then in the early 1970s, the system began to change and it began to grow. And it grew for the next 35 years. And we're now at the top of a plateau in which the incarceration rate is 5 times higher than its historic average. So what does this mean in terms of numbers? Well, by 2013, the latest year for which data are available, we've got about 1.6 million people in state or federal prison. So these are people serving time for a felony offence and about 28 months of time served at the median. We've got another 700,000 people serving time in local jails, and they're either serving short sentences or detained and awaiting trial. But this isn't the entire population under correctional supervision because we've got another 850,000 people who are under supervision under a parole officer out in the community, and we've got another 3.9 million people who are on probation. These are people serving suspended sentences out in the community. So you add all this up, and there are now about 7 million people in the United States under some kind of correctional supervision, either locked up in a prison or a jail, or reporting to a parole or probation officer. Now, as striking as these figures are, this isn't the most important thing about incarceration in the United States. The most important thing about incarceration in the United States is its unequal distribution across the population. So let's look quickly at some statistics on that. And in some work with Becky Pettit, who's now at UT Austin, Becky and I were looking at the likelihood that someone would serve time in prison at some point in their lives. Everything I've shown you so far is just a snapshot at a point in time. What's the fraction of the population that are incarcerated? Now we're trying to estimate the cumulative risk of incarceration, the lifetime risk of incarceration. Why might we be interested in a statistic like this? Well, we might think that serving time in prison affects a whole array of life chances even after you've been released. And what's the size of the pool of people who are at risk of those adverse life chances? So we looked first at a birth cohort born just after World War II, 45 to 49. And those people are reaching their mid-30s in the late 1970s. And we calculated for African Americans and for whites at different levels of schooling the likelihood that they would serve time in prison by the time they reach their mid-30s. And if we look just at African American high school dropouts, these are people who haven't completed high school. For this birth cohort that was born just after World War II, reaching their mid-30s in the late 1970s, before the prison boom has really taken off, about 15%, we estimate, are going to serve time in prison at some point in their lives. And we want to compare this birth cohort to one that's born 30 years later, in the late 1970s, the 75 to 79 cohort. They're growing up through the prison boom, and they're in their mid-30s right now, right? And so what do their lifetime risks of imprisonment look like? Well, for very low education, African American men, 70% we estimate will serve time in prison at some point in their lives. If we look just at non-college African American men, over a third will go to prison at some point in their lives. And this is historically novel, right? We only need to go back 30 years to find a point in history in which the criminal justice system was not a ubiquitous presence in the lives of African American men with low levels of schooling. So I spent a few years doing a lot of work like this, just trying to figure out the demographic contours of incarceration in America. And the question it raised for me, well, what are the consequences of all of this? And as a student of poverty and inequality, my focus was drawn to that question. What are the effects of incarceration on poverty and social and economic inequality in America? And to preview the conclusion, I want to argue that incarceration has created a novel kind of social inequality in America that's very intractable, very difficult to change through public policy. And it's very intractable because of three qualities. The inequalities that are created by incarceration are invisible. They're difficult to detect with our usual measures of the social and economic well-being of the population. The effects of incarceration are cumulative. They're concentrated in a segment of the population that's already extremely disadvantaged to begin with. And finally, the effects are intergenerational. The people who are negatively affected by incarceration are not just the people who serve time in prison, it's the families and children of those people serving time as well. So let me quickly do a little bit of work on each of these ideas: invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational inequality. So the idea is, with invisible inequality, is that the inequality created by incarceration is very hard to observe, and this is because incarceration is very socially concentrated in a fairly small fraction of the population, and the institutions in their nature are segregative. We don't have prisons sited in major cities, for example. They're often in far-flung locations that are very distant from the communities that are ascending to them. So they're hidden institutions to an important degree. And this is important for me as a sociologist because it means that incarceration is often overlooked as a source of social inequality, and we tend to underestimate inequality if we don't account for the incarcerated population. I want to give you a really simple illustration of this idea of invisible inequality. So if we look at something like an employment to population ratio, what fraction of the population are employed? There's a common statistic reported by the Census Bureau to measure the economic well-being of the population. And we normally measure this with a survey called the Current Population Survey. There's a monthly labour force survey that's drawn on a sample of households. Now, the Current Population Survey provides very, very accurate measures of things like unemployment and wages for the population of the whole. But for subgroups that have very high levels of institutionalisation, who don't live in households, they will not be measured by the Current Population Survey, and their economic status won't be reflected in our social accounting. So if we look at the Current Population Survey for African American men in their 20s and 30s, with very low levels of schooling, less than 12 years of schooling, and look at their employment rates, we can see that there's been a steady decline in employment among black men who have dropped out of high school from 1980 to the 2000s. It used to be above 60%, and according to the Current Population Survey, the household survey, it's down to about 40% by the 2000s. Now, of course, this survey doesn't count the incarcerated population, and the incarcerated population are not working in the census definition. They're not out in the open labour market. So our big innovation here was to simply count the incarcerated population in the denominator, in the population. And so what does the employment to population ratio look like when we count the entire population, including those institutionalised. And we can see that there's been a very, very substantial decline in employment, much larger than is reflected in the usual data sources. And we can also see that there was a significant decline in employment through the 1990s. And this is important because the 1990s were a period of very strong economic expansion, and there was a common understanding at that time that we could grow our way out of social problems. We didn't need social policy instruments to solve the problems of poverty and inequality in America. Instead, strong growth in the tight labour market would solve these problems for us. And clearly that's not been the case if we look at African American men with low levels of schooling. And their true employment rate now is down about 25%, and you'll remember that their incarceration rate's about 35%. So for African American men who have dropped out of high school, they're much more likely to be in prison or jail today than employed. So that's invisible inequality. What about cumulative inequality? The idea here is that the inequality created by incarceration diminishes the economic status of people whose economic opportunities are extremely poor to begin with. How can we see this idea of cumulative inequality? Well, there are a whole variety of studies that try to measure the effect of incarceration on people's wages and employment after they're released from prison, for example. So panel data estimates show that serving time in prison reduces your annual earnings by about 40%. My colleague in the Kennedy School, Diva Pager, and I conducted an experimental audit study where we sent people out to apply for jobs in New York City, and they would randomly present evidence to an employer of a criminal record in their resume. And if you present evidence of a criminal record in a job search, employers don't want to hire you. The effect is very large for African American job seekers, somewhat smaller for whites. The results indicate that employment is reduced by a third to a half by a history of incarceration. A simple empirical illustration of the magnitude of this is just data on earnings mobility. There's no model here or analysis or anything. This is just descriptive. And what these figures are showing is the chances that a low-income male worker in the bottom quintile of the earnings distribution is going to rise up out of the bottom quintile over a 20-year period. So we're thinking about 20-year earnings mobility. And for most low-income men, about two-thirds will rise up out of the bottom quintile over their lifetimes, over a 20-year period. If they have very low cognitive test scores, the rate of upward mobility out of the bottom quintile, it's only about 40%. If they dropped out of high school, the chances that low-income men will rise up out of the bottom quintile is only about a third. If they serve time in prison, they have the lowest mobility rates of all. It's only about 24%. And in fact, if you look at the earnings trajectories of people that have been incarcerated, they don't experience any earnings growth at all over the life course. This is enormously important because earnings growth is the engine by which male workers in particular come to play a whole variety of pro-social roles as breadwinners and providers, and that social role is essentially foreclosed to people who have served time in prison because they don't experience any earnings growth. Okay, final part, intergenerational inequality. Large numbers of people in prison means large numbers of kids with incarcerated parents. This is a very, very active area of research now, and the research is showing a whole variety of problems for kids with incarcerated parents. So aggressive behaviour, depressive symptoms, diminished school achievement are all things that have been found to be associated with the incarceration of parents, the research literature is also showing that these effects seem to be strongest for boys with incarcerated fathers. So I just want to give you a sense of the scale of this. If we look at the number of kids with incarcerated parents from the 1980s to the 2000s, by 2008, about 600,000 Latino kids had a parent in prison or jail. If we look at white kids, the number's about 750,000 have a parent in prison or jail. And if we look at African American kids, about 1.2 million African American kids currently have a parent in prison or jail. How many is that? That's about 1 in 9. 1 in 9 African American children currently have an incarcerated parent. Studies of cumulative risks show that about a quarter of African American children for a 1990 birth cohort will experience the imprisonment of their father by their 14th birthday. And again, this is historically very novel, right? We've only been in this period for about a decade now, even though it feels very familiar to many of us as a social reality. So, mass incarceration, right? We started with this term mass incarceration. What does it mean? This is sort of where I came to it on the basis of the work I was describing to you. I think when we have historically very, very high rates of incarceration and highly concentrated incarceration in a very disadvantaged segment of the population that promotes this very enduring kind of social inequality. Why is it enduring? Because it's invisible, cumulative, and intergenerational. Then we've essentially produced a new social group in American society. It's chronically poor. It has a social experience, this group, that's entirely different from any other group in American society. And communities with very high rates of incarceration, I think, now face very significant obstacles to full membership in American society. So this is sort of where I was in my research, I guess until about 5 or 6 years ago. I had sort of convinced myself that incarceration adds to the disadvantage of the poor. It creates another barrier to the upward mobility of poor children with incarcerated parents. And the redrawing of American social inequality by mass incarceration amounts to a contraction of citizenship, a contraction of that population that enjoys what T.H. Marshall called full membership in society. And what's more, we're threatened with a deep legitimacy gap now. The police, the courts, the prisons have really lost the confidence to an important degree of poor and minority communities. Police-community relations, we've seen this with the events of Ferguson, are adversarial now. To say that the police have a legitimacy problem is a massive understatement, I think. And the institutions that are charged with maintaining people's safety are viewed with enormous suspicion. And maybe these community level effects explain why reductions in crime associated with increased incarceration are estimated to be so small. So these are all elements of a vicious circle, I think. Deeper and invisible inequalities combined with a widening legitimacy gap between the poor and the mainstream. This makes the social exclusion produced by mass incarceration really difficult to change. So the question I began thinking about a lot is, how can this vicious circle be broken? I've argued that mass incarceration and all the inequalities that flow from it have created an outcast group that no longer shares in the full citizenship in American society. So against this great social distance that's been created, the extension of citizenship, the expansion of citizenship, I think, is fundamentally an act of political imagination. And the outsiders of American society have to be reconceived as insiders. That is very much the political project as I understand it. And for this to happen to an important degree, the insiders of American society have to recognize something of themselves in the citizens to be. That's the imaginative political act that has to happen for us to retreat from mass incarceration, I think. So in April 2012, a research team at Harvard began a series of interviews with 135 men and women and their families who were leaving prison and returning to neighborhoods in Boston. Nearly all the respondents we spoke to grew up in poor homes, but more than just poverty, violence and untreated addiction and mental illness were also common in their family backgrounds. Here's an excerpt from a paper I've been working on this year, and this is a discussion specifically of violence and the problem of violence. Patrick was born in 1981 and lived the first years of his life in the Old Colony housing projects, one of a cluster of public housing complexes in South Boston. Southie of the early 1980s remained one of the few neighbourhoods of concentrated white poverty in urban America and a stronghold of Boston's Irish-American working class. Patrick's mother was a heroin addict and gave up custody of her son to her parents when he was 5. She died of AIDS when Patrick was 17. Patrick's father had left his mother when his son was 2, but 20 years later, he would re-enter his son's life, helping him find a union job in the construction industry. Patrick's grandparents were reluctant guardians. His grandmother had raised a family of 8 children in the small wood house on J Street, a few blocks from Old Colony, and that was to become his childhood home. His grandfather had a 7th grade education and for many years struggled to find steady work because of his own criminal history. 13 people lived in the house when Patrick was growing up. Much of the energy at home was provided by his uncles, a brawling pair of young men who used drugs and alcohol heavily. My uncles and my mother were all heroin addicts, he told us. The house was the venue for violence, sexual abuse, addiction, and a sprawling kind of family life that Patrick described as emotionally cold and insane. And yet, he added, it was normal to me. Reflecting on the childhood home, Patrick's aunt recalled, it was just a crazy house. Between my brothers coming in, either beat up or having some horrible car accident or someone falling asleep with a cigarette and a mattress going up on fire, it was a very traumatic house to live in. Patrick's mother wasn't allowed in the house on J Street. Still, she stayed in contact with her son, and we know this through his descriptions of his beatings at the hands of his mother's boyfriends. This was from age 5 through his teenage years. So in violent, chaotic homes, the world isn't divided into victims and offenders, as the criminal justice system would often have it. Instead, in different times and places, people are victims and offenders and witnesses and participants, and each of these roles is inhabited in due course. And the prison, of course, can be a violent place too. One of my first interviews was at a minimum security prison with Peter, an African-American man in his late 40s who had spent most of the last 15 years in prison. Peter had a long history of violence that was episodically associated with drinking and drug use, and throughout his life he had dealt drugs, stolen cars, and got in fights. I want to show you a clip of Peter reflecting on the topic of violence and violence in prison.
As a kid, I thought my father was the toughest person. I thought the only person that was fair in me was my father. When I went to prison, I found out my father wasn't shit. He was scared of me. I stabbed 4 people in one day. I didn't care. I didn't care.
How old were you?
19, 20.
Yeah. Yeah. And what happened after that?
I went to the hole.
Yeah.
I went to the hole, and that's when they sent me up the Walpole. You know? But
yeah.
And from there, it was just uphill. Nothing but violence.
Yeah.
Violence. But I was never like that. I thought that I can go to jail and just stay to myself, do my time, and get out. Nope.
After his release, we saw in detail many of the challenges confronting people who leave prison. In the first week out, Peter applied to a community program for work clothes and a mass transit card. And at first he divided his time between a friend's place and his older sister's crowded home that also housed her fiancé, her daughter and her granddaughter. And over coming months, Peter began to develop a relationship with two of his three children and their two mothers. And he was closer to one mother and her child than another. And he seemed to have focused more attention on his 10-year-old son, though he did what he could to buy both his kids' clothes and school supplies. Peter was enrolled in food stamps and Mass Health, the Massachusetts Medicaid program. And each month he gave his $200 in food stamps to his sister. Through Mass Health, he attended mental health and substance abuse treatment, and he also had a physical and visited the dentist. Peter couldn't find work initially, but he did enroll in an employment program doing maintenance and operating machines. The program paid less than minimum wage, but he thought it was important to get into a daily routine. For 6 months in the work program, he'd get up at 5 in the morning, he'd be ready to start at 6:30, and he'd work through to 3 p.m. Every 2 weeks, he would report to his probation officer, and at weekends, he'd do community service in lieu of the $65 a month probation fee. And so now at age 47, he's been working most recently for the minimum wage, $8.50 in Massachusetts, at a laundry, and he's held that job for more than 6 months. As we got to know Peter, I learned that he grew up in the Lenox Street projects, a public housing complex in Boston's South End. He was a runaway as a kid, and from around the age of 12, he would leave his house for weeks at a time. One of his earliest memories of serious violence was outside an Irish bar in the neighbourhood of Mattapan. He and his cousin were involved in a fight, and in that melee, Peter saw a white man stabbed to death. He was 12 at the time. So mass incarceration looks a lot like this. It's not just a burgeoning prison population, but it's how so much of American poverty has come to be lived. The poor don't just live below an income threshold. Low income accompanies the tightly correlated adversity of violence and addiction and mental illness and childhood trauma and school failure and labour market discrimination and housing instability and family complexity. And on top of all of this, we've overlaid lengthy periods of penal confinement. So I think the re-entry study helps us understand our political choices. Because of its intimate connection with American poverty, overcoming mass incarceration depends a lot on this act of political imagination. How much can the insiders of American society see of themselves in Peter? Can we imagine a citizenry that includes Peter as much as it includes the rest of us? Peter's sold drugs. He's been on both sides of serious violence throughout his life. He's been locked up for most of his adult life. And for all of that, he gets up at 5 in the morning and he goes to look for work or he goes to programs and he meets his son after school and he says that street life is well behind him. So I think his daily struggle for his children and to be a father to his son is something that's deeply human and recognisable to everyone. But still, the future is really hard to predict for poor men with long criminal histories. And so could he once again wave a gun in someone's face, or abandon his kids, or relapse to addiction? Well, sure, of course he could. And a good part of Peter's humanity rests in those possibilities as well. So I think that's how big our compassion has to be if we're going to find a way out, if we're going to retreat from mass incarceration. Just as we entertain the possibility and hope that people can change, we equally have to recognise that sometimes that they can fail, and sometimes spectacularly. Just as it is for us, so much of Peter's humanity, I think, rests in this possibility that he might fail. The political question, I think, is, can we imagine a citizenry that includes all of us, including Peter? Right? That's the political question that we face. So we're asking of Peter at the age of 47, with all of the chaos and all of the violence that he's seen and experienced, that he make a change in his life. That's what the criminal justice system is asking of him. And I think surely we can ask the same of ourselves, right? Can we as a society make change and dissolve at least a little bit that line that's created a second-class citizenship in our most disadvantaged communities? I want to tell one last story to suggest all of the possibility that I think lies before us. I was in Addis Ababa a few years ago for a research project that we have studying justice institutions in Ethiopia. And I was at dinner with two Ethiopian researchers. And one of them, Mulugeta, told me about a colleague of his at his research institute, a German anthropologist. Well, one day the anthropologist was out in a remote area driving through a small village, and his car tragically struck a small child, killing her. And the girl's parents ran outside to see what had happened, and a crowd quickly formed around the anthropologist. And the parents tended to the child, and the anthropologist asked that the police be called. But he was told that there weren't any police there. The village dealt with matters like this by itself. Then the anthropologist was told that he could go, but they would send for him in a few days. And so he returned to Addis, and later that week a message came for him that he had to return to the village. And he was told that he had to return alone. And he went to my friend Mulugeta and he asked what he should do. And Mulugeta said, you have to go back to the village. And so he went back to the village. And when he got there, he was escorted to a meeting with the elders of the village. And first he was told to pay 2,500 birr, which is about $125, to the family of the dead child. And next he was ordered by the meeting to buy a goat for the family. And he purchased the goat, which was then immediately slaughtered. And the father of the dead child was then called to the front of the meeting. And the anthropologist, already standing at the front of the room, was told to hold out his hand. And he held out his hand, and his wrist was bound to the wrist of the child's father with the entrails of the goat. The village elder then announced that the anthropologist was now a member of the dead girl's family. And that was that. He was free to go. So he returned to Addis, and he was very upset. He felt that he hadn't properly compensated the family, nor had he been punished. And Mulugeta said to him, you have to understand that for the rest of your life, you are now a part of that man's family. You have all of the obligations of a family member. You have to visit from time to time. If they're going through problems that you could help with, you should help them, just as a member of their own family would. So sometimes our criminal justice system seems so large and so natural, so unchangeable, but it's only been with us in its current form for a few decades, and real alternatives are everywhere, like Ethiopia. So in this moment, I think we need to think broadly about justice. And we have to recognise the serious and sometimes brutal conditions that characterise America's unique brand of poverty. What if poverty breeds violence? and society consists more of violent contexts than violent people. Perhaps justice is then found less in the punishment of offenders and more in the abatement of those violent contexts. What if the problems of addiction and mental illness and physical disability are so serious that rehabilitative programs can't work? Not because people are unwilling to change, but because a normal life with a steady job and stable housing may just be out of reach. In these cases, I think we can respect human dignity by enabling the effort to struggle for it. And this means sometimes providing programs even when the outcome is uncertain. In these cases, the struggle itself is intrinsically meaningful. It's meaningful for those that might envision a better future for themselves, and it's meaningful for a community that's done something more than abandon the least among them. So to have this larger conversation about justice that I think we need, we have to know something about life on the edge, right? As informed citizens, we should know and understand how crime can flourish, the costs of untreated addiction and mental illness and homelessness and food insecurity. And for social researchers, for the social researchers in the room, we may need to comb through court records or file freedom of information requests or hang out on street corners or go into prisons. This is the kind of work, I think, that shines a light on the most severe hardship, and I think it's fundamentally humanising. It acknowledges the struggles of those who through their great social and economic disadvantage are mostly invisible or vilified in the mainstream of public discourse. Only then, when we understand how life is lived on the margins, can we begin to see something of ourselves in others, and I hope amidst all of the violence that we can ultimately find peace and justice. Thank you very much.